The Malice of Mary Marble, written by William Rain. Have you ever known one of those people who made you truly unsettled? For me, it was Mary Marble. She was a pretty girl. All things considered, she had long, straight, jet black hair, a fair complexion, and she spoke in a cute, squeaky voice. She was neither bigger nor smaller than any of the other kids at Grady Junior High, but she was always quiet and somber. Some would call her simple or slow, as she seemed very withdrawn and never went out of her way to talk to anyone. But her grades were above average, and she was always quick to correctly answer any question the teacher would send her way. By all accounts, there was nothing off-putting about the girl at first, but there was something in her eyes that would always send a shiver down my spine. At times, while kids loudly yelled and stomped through the halls of the school, Mary would just lean with her back against the wall and stare. A lot of times, she would just gaze off into space, seemingly lost in her thoughts, but other times, she would lock eyes with one of us fellow students. There was something unnerving about the way her dark eyes seemed to cut into us so deep that we couldn't look away. It was as though she had us in a trance and was somehow feeding on our subconscious minds. That's what we'd tell each other anyway, in a much more crude and childlike fashion. I'm not sure if I bought into such silly theories, but it was a defense mechanism of the insecure teenager to go out of our way to point a finger at someone else before one could be turned to us. Regardless of what the reasons were, her stare would cause me to feel incredibly uncomfortable, to the point I would even become queasy. I wasn't sure what it was, but something was off with that girl. I remember when she first appeared in our homeroom on the especially chilly morning in October. I can't remember the actual date, but I think it was around the middle of the month, if memory serves. I was only 11 years old and was still quite shyly getting used to the 6th grade in an American school. I was born in a little town in Scotland named Clackmannan, but had been forced to move to the States after my father received a job offer he couldn't refuse. I was 10 when we entered the country, and the school year was at its midway point, so I had a lot of trouble fitting in at first. It didn't take long for the novelty of a foreign kid earned me a handful of friends, and fortunately, they would be attending the same junior high as I in the fall. I was short and skinny and quite the nerd, but my friends were of similarly dorky tastes, so it worked out. Mary escorted into the class by the school counselor. He was a dodgy and short, balding man whose hair wrapped around the back and sides of his head like a pair of earphones that had slipped off the top. He had a thick caterpillar mustache that fluttered from his breath as he introduced her to the class. He seemed to be abnormally stuttering as he pronounced the girl's name to us, and he quickly turned around and darted out the door as soon as the information was relayed. Mary stood in front of the room wearing a black ruffled dress that came down to her black and white striped knee-high socks. She wore a similarly striped long-sleeve shirt under her dress, and her long hair flowed over her shoulders like a stream of black ink. I had just started really appreciating looking at girls, and I was instantly struck by how pretty she looked. She didn't seem uncomfortable or awkward as she stood before us in silence, but I stared into her face and I noticed that she had not blinked since I began looking at her. I quickly averted my gaze when she turned her eyes to meet mine, and I suddenly felt sweat from on my brow. I glanced back up for a moment and found her still staring at me. Wide-eyed and expressionless, I had fully intended to just take a quick peek before turning my gaze back to my closed notebook. But I couldn't look away, as I started to feel a chill across my spine. The teacher broke the silence in the room and asked Mary to take the open seat at the back of the room. Every head in the room followed the little girl as she paced gingerly to the rear of the classroom. They darted back forward when she turned to sit down. It became quickly clear that the new girl would be the primary topic for the gossiping children of Grady Junior High for the next few days. I was a shy kid in general, but almost paralyzingly so when attempting to talk to girls. "Hi," I said nervously to the wide-eyed girls, leaning up against the lockers after a sufficient amount of dares from my friends forced me to do it. She just stared at me as though I had attacked her with a slew of insults, rather than just offering her a simple greeting. Feeling my face flush, I continued, I'm Jacob. Everyone just called me Jake, though I giggled, feeling more awkward than jovial. Her dark eyes still just glared at me, and I was feeling incredibly uncomfortable as my friends chuckled from somewhere behind me. "Oh, okay then," I stuttered and turned to walk away. "Do you want to know when you're gonna die?" the little girl asked in her squeaky yet monotone voice. I turned back to her face, genuinely freaked out by her question. "Huh?" I replied. "I can show you," she continued, "if you want." I was stunned and wanted nothing more than to get as far away from her as I could. As I looked at her, the pale face that had previously seemed quite lovely to me now looked more sinister and malicious. There was something behind her eyes that sought to drill into my soul, and I felt a sudden panic grow from within me. I shook my head aggressively and said, "No." My eyes were fixed with hers as my head waved from side to side. "No, thank you." As soon as my words left my lips, I turned on the spot and walked quickly away. I got back to my friends and told them what had happened, to which they laughed and cheered and started making fun of her from a distance. Word spread quickly about the child's strange ways, even more so after a variety of other kids attempted to socialize with her. Regardless of the mockery and her complete lack of anything resembling friends, Mary never seemed brought down by things. Not that we could tell anyway. She seemed neither troubled nor content. Really, just neutral and blank. During the summer before our 7th grade began, Cindy Baxter, who I had also shared class with the previous year, was killed in a horrific accident. She had been riding her bicycle down the sidewalk, only yards from her home, where she lived with her younger sister and her mother. Her father, according to rumor, had been killed while serving overseas in the military. I only knew the girl in passing and wasn't familiar with her family at all, so take all of that with a grain of salt. There was a long ironwork fence that ran the length of the section of the sidewalk she was coasting her bike along, so when the small sedan that was speeding down the road that paralleled the path unexpectedly blew a tire, she did not have the slightest chance to get out of the way. As witnesses would report, the car instantly skidded to the side of the road, causing it to careen into the strong metal railing, with little Cindy Baxter caught between the two. By the time the story made it through all the exaggerated channels of the preteen gossip circuit, It told that the poor girl had been severed in two by the impact. By the time we returned to school in the fall, the story had grown far more morbid and grotesque, but the undeniable point remained. The poor little girl had died an untimely death, and the tragedy would only be the first of many to come over the following year. The room fell silent with the exception of a few kids crying when our homeroom teacher made the announcement about Cindy's death. We had all heard the news already, as it had happened some weeks before school began again, but the pain was still fresh to a lot of the kids who had known her. This, of course, set off the gossip chain once more, and the stories would be rehashed in vivid detail through the rest of the week. Tasha Holmes, one of Cindy's best friends, mentioned that Cindy had made the effort to speak to Mary Marble several times in the days before school let out for the summer. She told us that the wide-eyed girl had apparently asked Cindy the same question she presented to me in our first and only meeting. When Tasha asked her friend if she had accepted Mary's offer of prediction, Cindy just looked off to one side and shook her head. She had been distant and dreamy over the days that followed. According to Tasha, Johnny Roma, a quick-witted and outspoken member of my little group, became convinced that Mary was a witch and swore he would confront her about the whole thing. The rest of us laughed at him and told him he should stop staying up late to watch horror movies with his older brother. He mumbled a slew of words that I would never be allowed to say without fear of the back of my father's hand, and stormed off down the crowded hall. As the days progressed, more kids had started to hold Mary responsible for little Cindy's death. They were convinced she was anything from a murderous little psychopath to the Antichrist herself. I find the whole thing to be blown out of proportion. The accident was tragic and sad, but nothing that would appear to have been supernaturally encouraged. Tony and Charles, the other two members of my dorky friend circle, shared my mindset on the topic and were tired of hearing about it. Even at our ages, we knew that dwelling on something such as this would not allow anyone to move on from it. Charles did feel a little bad after he barked at Johnny for spilling his silly theories one day. We just arrived at lunch and Johnny was just staring at Mary from across the room while going on and on about what a monster she is. Charles just lost it. I can't recall how the dialogue between them went, but it ended with many eyes in the room transfixed on the two of them until Johnny yelled at everyone to leave him alone. His words were more colorful than mine, but you get the idea. Later that same day, I saw Johnny talking to Mary from a distance. His demeanor was confrontational at first, but gave way to something very different as the conversation went on. I noticed his shoulders droop as his head hung low while she stared in her normal blank expression. My friend turned on his heels and ran up the hallway while she watched his exit. He was out of my sight before he escaped hers, but as I turned to look at her, she turned again to face me. We locked eyes as other kids walked back and forth between us. Even when our line of vision was blocked, I could still feel her gaze. It felt as though we were the only two people in a deserted room, and I felt cold and lost the longer we stared at each other. We finally broke eye contact when a bigger kid charged down the hall, knocking me almost to the floor. He seemed on a mission of sorts and paid no attention to my stumbling and grasping for anything to prevent my fall. I finally composed myself and looked across the hall to see that Mary no longer stood there. Though the experience had been less than comfortable, I went on about my day as any other, though I would never see Johnny again. The news of his death greeted me early the following morning after my mother received a phone call that caused her to gasp and place a hand over her heart. Johnny had been walking along a nearby train track late the previous night, apparently very distracted as he did not notice sounds of the approaching train. There was little left of his body, which made his identification no easy task. But word leaked out quickly once the information was discovered and had reached across the little town of Grady. Before we could lay foot on school grounds, my mother had given me the option of staying out of school for a few days, as Johnny and I had grown close over the last year. But even at my young age, I knew staying at home would only lead to brooding about the loss of my friend. Children and teachers alike shed tears for Johnny when school began that day, and many would leave to make their way to their respective homes over the following hour or two. Charles, Tony, and I sat in silence at lunch, as we could not seem to find the words to break the suffocating quiet. Other kids still cried at nearby tables, while others hung their heads and attempted to eat their food. Johnny had been a fairly popular kid, which had always puzzled me along with the others of our dorky little group to why he would spend his time with us. He said he could be himself around us, but always felt like he had to put on a show with others. Though he enjoyed his popularity, he would often remark on his envy for us, and how we could blend into the background and go unnoticed. It had seemed insulting to us, but his sincerity could not be denied. Over the course of the school year, another 3 children would meet their end, each in a more gruesome fashion than the last. Bridget Morgan, an 8th grader who had always been athletic and lively, dropped to her death from a nearby cliff surrounding a quarry. She had struck sharp rocks and pointed tree roots during her descent, which had torn her poor body to shreds by the time her fall came to its grisly end. Billy Jordan, a 6th-year student, was torn apart by wildlife in the woods that surrounded our town, presumably bears or wolves. Finally, Andrew Barnes, an 11th grader and friend to many, had fallen into the wood chipper on his grandfather's farm. Many believed that a curse had befallen the town of Grady, and my little group of friends had grown convinced that the curse was named Mary Marble. By the time our 7th grade came to an end, we had added 3 new friends to our growing club. Sarah and Veronica Burgess were twin sisters who shared the same grade as us. They were both really pretty with matching long red hair. Sarah was more freckled than our sister, who was far more outgoing than her, but they were equally as sassy. I had developed something of a crush on Sarah, though I would not really admit that to anyone until some years later. They were both a little nerdy, like the rest of us, but it only served to make Sarah more appealing to me, with her thick rimmed glasses and slight lisp when she spoke. Josh Holden, who had suffered the wrath of many a "holding me groin" joke over the years, was a quiet kid but could be quick with a joke once you got him talking. He had shaggy brown hair that was parted in the center and sported a fairly stocky build for his age. They filled out our group quite well, and they shared our belief that Mary was the root of all the evil that had befallen our school. We made plans to find out everything we could about her before school resumed the following year, but we could not have predicted where our investigation would take us. It was rare for anyone to see Mary outside of school, and nobody had the slightest clue where she lived. She had no friends to speak of, nor did she seem intent on making any. The fact that many kids had become terrified at the thought of opening up a conversation with her had given her quite the status as the school's biggest outcast. Every now and then, I would feel bad for her, sitting alone at a corner table in the lunchroom, but then I would recall the discomfort I felt whenever our eyes would meet. It was something of a conundrum, since I knew all too well the feeling of being rejected because of my differences. Even so, she was a pariah, and I knew behind that cute little face lay pure evil. So, my motley crew would spend the weeks after school let out investigating the town's history for any circumstances in its past that resembled our current situation, or pacing the town streets, seeking any evidence of Mary herself. Maybe we had seen too many movies or read too many stories of recurring atrocities in the smaller cities of the nation. Or perhaps we just had no clue where to look for answers to the events that had brought this town to a 7 o'clock curfew. Sure, older teenagers would still party into the wee hours of the night, and group of kids could still be seen spending time in the parks and playgrounds after the sun went down. But the police only seemed primarily focused on children who were alone after hours. As it turned out, Grady did harbor some mystery in its history, which Sarah and I agreed sounded like an excellent title to a Scooby-Doo episode. She had the cutest giggle, and the way she would cover her mouth with the tip of her fingers when she laughed would make me smile like an idiot every time. Charles would often nudge Tony, and they would both silently chuckle when I would stare at Sarah with my cheesy grin. But I would just flip them off when nobody was looking, which would only serve to make them laugh harder. Though our research gave us some grim history, it did not provide us with any answers to the town's current dilemma. It seemed there had been a woman, some 100 or so years before, named Daphne Clayton, who had committed a rash of brutal homicides of the children of Grady. When she finally captured and interrogated on the motivations behind her horrible crimes, she confessed that the death of her own children had driven her to such deplorable acts. Regardless of her claims, there was no evidence that she had ever been a mother, to which she would insist it was many years before she found herself in this town. She was hanged for her crimes after a very short trial. It came out after some years of concealment of the true depravity of her actions, that she had, in fact, fed on the children she had murdered. I lay, the half-eaten Twinkie I had been chewing on, to rest when Josh narrated this particular excerpt from the ancient newspaper reel he had jotted down during his trip to the library. Veronica looked as though she were close to spewing her own snack across the floor of our shoddy treehouse, while her sister slapped her on the back to help control her spluttering cough. Aside from the gagging Ronnie, as we had nicknamed her, nobody else was saying a word, though we had plenty of outrageous theories about Mary Marble being the reincarnation of the cannibalistic Daphne Clayton. We had nothing rational or realistic to go on. We had begun to lose hope in our short career as budding sleuths until we heard the news that a child had gone missing. Gregory Banks and his family had only recently moved into town, and he had not yet attended school in the area. Nobody knew much about them, but they had apparently migrated here from the big city to live in a less crime-ridden environment. Bad idea, Banks' family. A search party was set up quickly, though it bore no results. The mystery of the missing Banks child would be just another log on the fire for us. We couldn't give up on our quest for answers, even though the police department seemed as dumbstruck by everything as the rest of us. Accidents can be chalked up to chance, but a missing child could mean so much more. As August was approaching, we had almost given up hope in finding answers before a new school year began. Though we had grown close, we weren't spending as much time in a group of late, since our investigation had become an obsession that had started to wear on us as a whole.
We would still gather together a few days a week, but we had started spending more time apart than we had at the beginning of the summer. Not to mention our parents had grown more restless since the bank's boy vanished, and they were worried about letting us leave our respective homes. It was a rainy Tuesday, the only 2 weeks before the beginning of the school year, when I received a frantic phone call from Tony. He claimed he had found where Mary Marple lived. The reception was terrible on the glossy brown rotary phone my parents had owned since we moved into this country, so I could only make out so much of what he was saying. I asked him to repeat what he said multiple times, but that only served to frustrate his already frenzied state. He was in the middle of hysterically attempting to convey the information when he suddenly fell silent. "Tony?" I barked into the phone. "I gotta go," he replied, in a very subdued voice. "Tony, are you okay?" I asked. The line went dead, and I assumed he had hung up the phone. His body was found the next day at the tree line of the same woods in which Billy Jordan was found. Tony was found with both legs and his left arm missing, along with a giant hole in his chest where his heart used to reside. In reports I would not have access to until many years later, his limbs had appeared to be pulled from their sockets. That part still leaves a threatening lump in my throat to this day. For a few weeks, the woods were closed to the public while the police investigated the area, since 2 children had brutally lost their lives behind those trees. After finding nothing they considered dangerous, it was once more opened back up to the public, though nobody seemed remotely interested in spending time there. By the time our 8th grade began, many families had moved away from our little slice of hell on Earth. Sarah and Ronnie had been moved to Florida with their parents, but Sarah vowed to keep in touch. We would write back and forth and occasionally talk on the phone, but eventually lost touch, as many long-distance friendships do. Charles and Josh were still around, but Tony's death had taken a toll on Charles, as they had been tight since kindergarten. He wouldn't talk much anymore and remained distant, no matter how hard Josh and I tried to break free from the depression which consumed him. It looked as though it was down to Josh and I to carry on alone after another month passed, to find Charles and his family heading for another state. I wished him well and asked him to keep in touch, but he never did. I would find him again some years later, when social networking allowed easy access to relationships gone by. But he had long since moved on from the events that shattered his youth, and I chose to leave it at that. Perhaps my face reminded him of memories that still haunted his dreams. Maybe he just had no care for friends of old. Regardless, he seemed to have a happy life now, and I wished him the best. Josh and I had determined that we would follow Mary home from school the day after Charles left. Our first few days of attempting pursuit of the wide-eyed little girl proved fruitless. We made the mistake of following too closely the first day, which caused her to run after she saw us. We tried to catch up to her, but she was so much faster than us. By the time we buckled and held our splitting sides, she was far from view. We gave it a couple of days before trying again, as we felt as we had blown out cover, so to speak. As we neared the weekend, we tried again, but she easily slipped away from us since we followed from way too far behind, seemingly overcompensated after being spotted the first time. We realized we would have to practice far more stealth to be able to track her to where she lived. On Wednesday of the following week, we ducked out of school early to make our way to the farthest point we had managed to follow her to. We ducked behind the trees until she came strolling by. Swinging her bag back and forth while she walked, she appeared so cute and harmless in the way she carried herself. But we just knew something sinister lay below the surface. Once we were sure she had not seen us, we began our pursuit again from a safe distance. We were doing our best to keep our foots silent and would duck out of sight when she would. On occasion, stop and turn around. We lost her again after stalking her for a solid 20 minutes or so, but we had earned a new starting location for our hunt. We commenced our quest again the next day after ditching school at an even more premature hour than the last, only to lose her once more at the tree line of the woods on the edge of the town. These were the same woods that Billy, Jordan, and Tony had found themselves torn apart in, though we had never had the reason to believe that any hostile wildlife resided inside, especially after the sheriff saw fit to strip the caution tape from the trees. Even with that in mind, the knowledge that we lost Mary at the edge of the very same woods in which two of her victims had met their end, we thought it best if we armed ourselves before entering. The weekend arrived and we would likely not have an opportunity to track our prey again until the next school day, so we chose to work on gathering supplies for a final showdown. Should it occur, I can't say I wasn't nervous or apprehensive at the thought. I was fucking terrified, to be honest, but I felt a lot safer with Josh by my side. He was way stronger than me, but I had never been much of the athletic type. He was already bench pressing 180 pounds in our weight training class. I managed to push 115 one day, but that was with him spotting me and doing most of the work. He would insist that it was all me, but I knew he was just being kind. We had grown to be close friends since the rest of the group had separated, and I knew he would have my back if things got out of hand. When we crossed into those woods, we spent the Saturday gathering together what we could. I managed to snatch the axe my dad used to cut wood, though it was way too heavy to swing, a baseball bat from when I had attempted pitifully to learn American sports, and a couple of torches. Josh laughed and corrected my terminology to flashlights when I presented them to him. He had gathered 2 machetes, one of them pretty rusty but still sharp, and some football pads for protection for both of us. He also had some knee and elbow pads along with some really cool fingerless leather gloves that he swiped from his older brother's room. He only had the one pair of those, and I can't say I wasn't a little jealous. He looked really cool suited up, but I felt a little awkward when I slipped the pads on as they felt huge on me. He said it didn't matter how they looked, only that they kept me safe. He was right, but I still felt a bit silly. I suggested we try to locate some sort of protection for our heads too. And Josh slapped his hand to his face as he hadn't even thought of that. We chose to abandon the axe when Josh agreed that it felt clumsy and awkward to swing. So I would return that to my dad's shed later. That day, we still had Sunday to make final preparations for Monday, so we packed up our battle gear in the treehouse and tried to spend the rest of the day having fun. Sunday did not go as planned, thanks to a horrendous storm that destroyed any plans for an excursion outdoors. So Josh suggested that we just lay out of school entirely on Monday to be able to be ready and waiting in the woods when Mary arrived on her journey home. It seemed logical, and I just spent the day relaxing in my bedroom while MTV provided music videos to serve as my soundtrack for the rainy Sunday. Monday came and I left for school. As far as my parents knew, I boarded the bus like any other weekday, but darted off of school grounds as soon as the bus rode off. I met Josh at the treehouse where I had found him waiting with 2 football helmets, just like the now Soaking wet football pads, it was too big for my head. But my friend had already thought of that and handed me a knit cap to wear under it. Not only did it provide enough padding to stop the headgear from rattling around my head, but it made it a great deal more comfortable. We hung the pads on one of the tree branches to the side of our little clubhouse and hoped they would dry off at least somewhat before we would make our way to the woods. After visiting a nearby convenience store to stock up on snacks, that would be our lunch for the day. Using our mutually saved up allowance, we spent the rest of the morning and early afternoon waiting in our treehouse, snacking and talking until we could make our way to the forest. It was a good walk to get there. I think we were slightly concerned that passing drivers would alert our parents to our playing hooky from the school. Those were inherent problems for rule-breaking kids of small towns. Worst cases, we would get a good chewing out from our folks if we survived whatever may unfold behind the tree line. It wouldn't be the worst possible scenario to come out of this. At around 1 o'clock, we loaded up our bags and began to stroll to the woods at the edge of the town. We had considered riding our bikes with our bags of supplies strapped to our backs, but they would be hard to hide from the approaching Merry Marble. Josh suggested that we at least take them halfway and stash them somewhere, to which I replied that I was worried they would get stolen, or even worse, that our parents would notice they were gone and know we had skipped school. So we walked and tried our best to hide when cars would approach from either direction. We weren't the most effective with our attempts at stealthy maneuvering and inadvertently drew more attention to ourselves with our leaps behind fences and trees while loaded up with bulging backpacks. In the long run, nobody seemed to care what we were up to while they were consumed with their own day's activities. After a little under an hour of half worth of exhausting traveling, we finally arrived at the tree line. We hesitantly crossed through the trees to find the woods not as dense as we expected. This would make it hard for us to keep our presence hidden from our target. Not to mention that we had not taken into account how uneasy it is to remain silent in the woods, especially in the fall and winter as dried and dead leaves lined up the forest floor. We decided to climb into the trees and attempt to remain hidden in the leaves above. It may have not been an effective plan when it came to following behind our mark, but we jumped off that bridge when we got to it. My feet had already gone to sleep by the time Mary passed through from where the outside world met the forest. She hesitated for a moment and looked from side to side. Luckily for us, she did not look up, as the trees weren't nearly as full as they were in the summer, and we would likely be as obvious as bright red and throbbing thumbs sprouting from the trees' barks. Were she to glance our way, we were able to watch her as she strolled forward in a straight line as she could traverse over the bumpy terrain. Josh had the idea to toss a pine cone off into the distance to hopefully mask our descent from our trees. This only served to cause our mark to quicken her pace, though it also inspired the scurrying of a variety of the wood's inhabitants. I could see a deer sprinting far ahead, as well as some squirrels that had apparently been spooked by a salting pine cone. This would help camouflage and crunching leaves beneath our feet, which was much more aggravated sound due to the pins and needles that shot through my legs as blood flowed freely once more. As if brought to life by the combination of footsteps provided by Marble and ourselves, the forest had come to life with a cacophony of woodland creatures bounding between, up and across the trees. It was unsettling how silent and still it had been before the wide-eyed girl entered, but it did allow us to remain unnoticed, or so we hoped. We would regularly hide behind trees in hopes of remaining out of sight, should she glance to her rear, but all was working in our favor for the time being. I was struck suddenly with the weight of how deep these woods appeared to run. We had been following from a distance for around 20 minutes according to the digital watch on my wrist. Though it should not have been late enough for the sun to set, the world around us began to fall into darkness. My feet had been hurting for a few minutes now, and I was starting to regret this whole thing. Josh looked equally as tired as I, and our ability to remain stealthy had worn thin. We looked at each other while Mary walked on far ahead of us. Josh took his head and shrugged his shoulders. I nodded in agreement. As exhausted as we were at this point, we would be hard-pressed to put up much of a fight should one occur. I turned my attention back to the woods in ahead and felt like a complete fool when I could no longer see any sign of Mary. Josh had just noticed too, and he looked back at me with panic and frustration in his eyes. God damn it! My friend swore in a little more than a whisper. We had jogged ahead to the last point we had seen our target. It had become as dark as if it was the middle of the night. But we were uncertain about using our torches. We didn't know if Mary had noticed us and was only hiding somewhere now, or if we had simply missed her making a turn. The last thing we wanted was to alert her to our presence. She was not already aware of it. That being said, we could not see anything. Josh pulled out his flashlight and turned it on while keeping his hand shielding the light from spreading too far. To add to our dilemma, we had been too busy paying attention to our pursuit. We had no idea how to get back out of these woods. Surely it felt like we were going straight, but the terrain was uneven and bumpy, and we were being guided by someone who appeared to know this forest well. It had been a solid 10 minutes since we had last seen Mary, and we were basically running around in no particular direction now. This only served to make us even more lost as we no longer knew which direction we had come from. I was beginning to panic when I heard a sudden scream coming from where Josh had been standing. I looked around in the direction of the panic yell to find my friend gone. I ran to the last spot I had seen him, but saw no trace of where he had disappeared to. I was darting my eyes from side to side looking for any trace of Josh. My heart was racing and I had began to hyperventilate. I just knew she had gotten to him. Maybe she had been aware of us following behind her this whole time. Perhaps she was just waiting for the right moment to pounce. I started calling out for my friend, still attempting to keep my voice low, just in case she had not already spotted us. It was at this point I realized how quiet everything had grown. No birds chirping or animal running between the trees or up them. The dead leaves in the ground didn't even seem to split and crack the way they had only minutes before. My hands shook violently as I reached into my backpack to retrieve my torch. I clicked it on and shone the light around me, taking no care to who might spot the glare through the darkness. I felt my bladder attempting to give way, but I fought against it. I was starting to feel quite sure that I would never see outside those woods again. "Jake!" I heard my name called out from afar. It didn't sound as though it was coming from ahead or behind, but below. I directed the light from my torch to the ground beneath my feet. I tried to follow the sound to seek out where it was coming from. I felt my feet slip out from under me and I fell to the ground. I gathered myself together and pointed the beam of my light to the ground ahead of me. There was a deep ditch that sloped down to meet a hole in the forest floor. It was then I noticed how wet the ground was here. That would seem to be why the leaves no longer crunched under my footsteps. Likely the reason I almost slid feet first into the hole also. I gently crawled to where the circle of apparent nothingness lay in the middle of the woods and pointed my flashlight through the opening. I could hear Josh calling my name from somewhere below and felt a huge weight lift itself from me when I saw him through the torchlight. He looked to be around 30 to 20 feet below, and I couldn't help but wonder how he had survived the fall that found him there. He waved and pointed his finger towards the opening, which seemed unnecessary. Since I was well aware of what I was looking through, I finally noticed what he was getting at. When I saw the vine-like rope that disguised itself between the wet leaves that lined the circumference of the gaping maw in the ground, I nodded to Josh and reached out for the rope. I was nervous about scaling such a distance, as the weight of my bag supplies I carried on my back would surely surpass the capacity of my grip strength and muscles. But I had to get down there. The mouth on the forest floor was more than wide enough for me to fit through with my backpack in place. But my heartbeat sped again when I found myself hanging above the open space below. My descent was slow, but I felt a head rush of delight when my feet felt ground beneath them once more. My friend slapped me on the back when I landed, and I noticed his palms were fiery red after he winced from the enthusiastic greeting. Josh explained to me how he had slipped through the hole, just as I almost had. He found himself falling through the air to face a certain death when he managed to wrap his hands around the hanging rope. The thread tore through his skin as he had lost a lot of momentum built up from his fall. But he managed to slow himself enough that when he landed, he remained in one piece. His palms were inflamed and the skin was shredded in places, so we wrapped them up as best as we could with loose fabric from his baggy and torn shirt. He joked about how he didn't want to look like he was wearing a midriff if he got out of here, so we clumsily used one of the machetes to cut the cloth from his sleeves. Josh had very muscled arms for his age and was not against the way his shirt appeared now. Claimed he looked buff. We chuckled a bit, though we were still reeling from this whole experience. Finally, taking the opportunity to look around our newfound surroundings, we were both shocked to look upon the wide open space that lay before us. It appeared to go on for quite some distance, both in front and behind us. We could see walls formed from rocks and dirt on either side of us, but the caravan was easily some 60 or 70 feet wide. Though we were no experts on measurements of distance, being still confused about which direction we had come from, we were unsure about which way to go, given the fact that Mary had vanished before us in a matter of seconds, in a similar fashion to how my friend disappeared. We had to assume that her location was also down here somewhere. Josh suggested that we follow the path we were facing, to which I shrugged my approval. His guess was as good as mine after all. The cavern we found ourselves in was not as dark as the forest above us had become, so we felt no need to shine our torchlight ahead of us. We couldn't tell where the light generated from, but it was as easy to see it would be on a cloudless night with the full moon glowing from above. I'm not entirely sure why we didn't question our situation a lot more than we did. Perhaps it's because we were still children and still believed in the fantasies that our books and movies revealed to us. Maybe it was just that we were already too scared to seek rationality. Of course, it could be that we were just incredibly stupid for letting things go this far. We followed the cave for maybe 10 minutes before we reached a dead end. The path had become narrow as the walls on either side slowly closed themselves in front of us. Josh sighed heavily and we shrugged to each other before we turned around and headed back the way we came. Our pace had slowed dramatically, so it would be closer to 20 minutes before we strolled past the rope that dangled from the forest floor above. We were growing increasingly tired from the amount of walking we had already done today, and I was silently regretting skipping school in favor of this ridiculous quest. Another 30 minutes or so later, we finally reached what surely had to be our destination, though it thoroughly perplexed us to look upon what was before us. Off in the distance ahead, where the ground lowered to grow far deeper below the woods we had traversed what felt like hours ago, stood a quaint log cabin. It was a very nice looking house, which we appreciated more the closer we got. It had green vines that appeared to weave around the cabin like a protective cage. The structure looked like it would be more fitting on the ledge of a mountain somewhere overlooking the world below. It was the last thing we expected to see buried deep under the ground. But it strangely made things feel less threatening. Perhaps we were wrong about Mary. Maybe she was just a normal kid who never blinked and lived in a cottage miles into and under the forest. Yeah, totally normal. We approached the building and took note of the warm light glowing from behind one of the second-story windows. The curtains were drawn and we could make out no signs of life behind them. I glanced at my watch for the first time since we reached the edge of town, where the tree line stood, to see that it was close to 7 o'clock. I knew that my parents would be panicking by now, especially considering the ongoing curse that had befallen our little town. I only hoped that they would be understanding when we explained that we had successfully put an end to plague once and for all. Maybe I was getting a little ahead of myself. Unsure of what our next move should be, I suggested that we wait until all of the lights were out in the house before we tried to enter. We're already surely grounded at the very least. No sense in rushing it now. Josh agreed, and we hid ourselves below the railing of the front deck that wrapped around the cottage and the cave. We would take turns looking up to check on the light on occasion, but it would be some time before the house fell into darkness. It was nearing 10 o'clock when the whole cavern around us felt dark. Somehow the lights from inside the house had generated the glow through the entire underground, though it made little sense to entertain such a thought. We started to climb the steps that led to the patio and Josh gave a slight jump when the second step squealed beneath his foot. We stood as a deer in headlights for a moment before feeling safe that we were still unnoticed. My friend looked from side to side as my outstretched arm attempted to turn the doorknob. Of course that would be too easy, I thought to myself when the knob wouldn't turn. We worked our way around the deck, checking all of the windows until we found one unlatched at the far left, toward the rear of the house. Josh lifted it slowly and peeked his head inside. He held a hand out for me to hand him one of the torches, since the inside of the cabin was as pitch dark as the cavern that surrounded us. Assured everything was clear, Josh slid through the window and I followed in behind him. It struck me how perfectly normal this place looked. Average furniture you would expect to see in an average home. The picture that hung up on the walls had a similar motif as those I had seen in various hotel rooms that my family had stayed in during the occasional holidays. There was a lighthouse overlooking an unspecified ocean in one. Another had a pretty landscape of a mountainside, not indifferent from one that may have a cabin, such as this one perched upon of its ledges. No pictures of the family that lives here, though one impersonal image of other places, each unique in its own way. We inspected the perfectly normal rooms as we stalked our way through the cabin, but found nothing that would imply this place held nothing more sinister than a very average family. The kitchen held all the average foods and utensils any other kitchen would. I halfway expected to find human organs wrapped in transparent plastic when we opened the freezer door. But no. Only very generic frozen dinners, with a healthy amount of frost built up upon the boxes. Though everything looked right in its place, everything in here felt unused. The dishwasher was empty, the canned goods in the pantry had dust gathered on top and around, and the condiments were all far beyond their expiration dates. Seemed all of this was a facade to fool prying eyes, but why go to such lengths when this house sat in a location that nobody would easily stumble across? Regardless of how the kitchen appeared, we had found nothing that convinced us this house held anything malicious. That was, however, until we found the basement door. We had a good idea that Mary would be in the room on the second, from which light shone through earlier. Perhaps we were stalling our ascent up the stairs. But we assured ourselves that we only sought to be thorough. Having inspected all the rooms on the ground floor, the only door we had left to rule out was the one at the end of the hallway. Judging by how long the house had appeared from the outside, that one final door should have logically led back outside. This is why we made no effort to investigate it at the first place. We may have chosen to check it out in spite of the fact, because we were still in no rush to reach the second floor. Josh swung the door open with little care, being that we expected to find the rear deck before our eyes. What lay before us was a concrete staircase that led downwards. Any basement to the house should have led back under the building, but this stretched ahead of us. Assuming that we simply misjudged the length of the cabin, we headed down into the black. Our flashlights only carved the slightest circle of visibility through the thick darkness, which was an eerie thing in itself. Josh shook his torch as if to force the presumably weakened batteries back to life to no avail. I handed him my light, but it performed no better than his. We continued on. The flight of stairs carried on for far longer than we had expected, covering the distance of maybe 3 times the height of the house above us. We reached the bumpy concrete floor below and saw the cave that stretched out in front of us. The further we got in, we began to notice a warm glow of light in the distance. Josh clicked the button on the torch, effectively snuffing our own life out. We arrived at the mouth of a large circular cave which was slightly lit, with 2 candles on either side. In the center lay a large bed with a small table on its right. There was someone under the mossy green blanket that was sprawled across the mattress, and they looked to be sound asleep. The closer we got, the less human the shape under the blanket appeared. The shape that formed beneath the sheets was almost snake-like, but lay the length of a tall person. I covered my mouth when I gasped upon seeing what the table beside the bed held. It was a glass bowl, possibly crystal, that contained 2 human eyes which seemed to gaze up at us. The mass under the table blanket shifted, and we heard a scuffling sound behind us. "You don't belong here," the squealing voice of Mary Marble chanted from the darkness. I whipped around to see her charging at us. She had an expression of her face far wider than the blank stare she normally wore. Her brow wrinkled and contorted into a violent sneer. I pulled out my baseball bat and Josh grabbed for his machete. I was terrified but prepared to stand my ground. She was almost on top of us when her clothes just dropped to the floor as her body evaporated from inside them. I darted my eyes around the room as the thing on the mattress looked to be attempting to wrestle itself out from beneath the blanket. Josh and I spread out as we cut our eyes from the bed to open room and back once again. I heard a sound as if somebody was raising the volume on the TV as one of the characters on screen began to wail. The sound belted from right beside me until I found myself pushed to the ground. The force behind the shove was strong. It felt as if a heavily muscle-grown man pushed me to the floor. I saw Josh hit the ground while I picked myself back up. I was swinging the back and forth against the air around me as I thought the wind itself was my enemy. I felt a slap across my face, followed by a punch to the gut. It knocked the wind out of me, and then I struggled to stay on my feet. That was when I saw the hand reaching out from the blanket. The hand looked human in shape, but scaled like a lizard. The long fingers wrapped around the eyes that lay in the glass bowl. I watched the hand as it raised up to place them into the open sockets of the scaly face that raised from the bed to meet them. In all honesty, the face was not unattractive. Which was the last thing I needed my mind to latch onto right now. It was equally as lizard-like as the hands, but the shape and contours of the face were soft and ladylike. My legs were knocked out from under me, and I found myself on the cave floor once again. I noticed I could actually make out the misty form of our assailant when she came close. It was as if Mary was made of smoke or fog when she struck, but she hit like a truck when she made contact. As I battled the ground to release me again, I saw the lizard woman on the bed whip out from under the sheets. She was fast, crazy fast, while Mary knocked me down once more, causing my helmet to fly off of my head and roll across the floor. A scaled woman charged at Josh after rappelling off of the wall that circled the cave. She was a female for sure. Her upper body wore the undeniable attributes of her gender. Her lower body formed the shape of a giant snake. She was scaled from head to tail, and her open, screaming mouth revealed long and pointed teeth within. The lengthy, flowing blonde hair that blew behind her as she sped towards my friend appeared incredibly out of place, and I found myself momentarily distracted by that. The sharp claws on the lizard woman's three-fingered hands swiped at Josh, tearing through the flesh on his right shoulder. He yelled and swung with his machete. He only swatted the air as she struck again, this time across his midsection. He winced and buckled to his knees. Mary bore down on me with a great force. She punched me in the face and pounded my chest. I tried to fight back, but she was only solid when her blows landed. I momentarily grabbed her when it pounded at the same place on my chest multiple times, but it dissolved into smoke before I could return any sort of attack. Josh and I were both bleeding and bruised and showed little hope of surviving this. What were these things, I asked myself, my mind grasping at straws. To make sense of it all, the lizard creature bore down on Josh once more, and everything seemed to move in slow motion before my eyes. She reached back with her clawed left arm and held her right out in front of me. She leapt at the roof of the cave and launched herself back towards my friend. My senses blurred momentarily as another punch landed me across the jaw, causing my head to spin. I looked up in time to see the scaled fingers bury themselves into my friend's chest. He screamed as she reared back and prepared to bury her left hand beside her right when Josh sank the blade of his machete deep into her throat. A guttural and gargle scream echoed the wall of the cave as the misty form of my attacker became solid again. I grabbed for my baseball bat and tried to swing, but she jumped off of me and sprinted in long strides to the creature who was spewing thick, dark blood onto my friend. The wailing scream made my ears burn, and I clutched my hands around them, dropping my bat to the ground. Mary, now fully solid and seemingly human in appearance, pulled the scaled woman off of Josh and pleaded for her not to leave her. The creature's wails finally faded into spluttering coughs, and she fell silent. Mary released a frantic yell, filled with rage, and jumped onto Josh, who had been clutching at the holes in his chest and writhing on the ground. She wrapped her solid human hands around his throat and screamed and bellowed in his face, saliva dripping from her mouth. He tried to fight against her, but she was proving so much stronger than she was before, now that the fury consumed her. My baseball bat broke in half across the back of Mary Marble's head after I swung it with every single ounce of strength I had left. Her naked body crashed to the ground and stopped moving while bright red blood leaked from where the now splintered wood had made contact. I crawled over the ground where Josh lay, showing no signs of movement. I shook him wildly as though he were just sleeping soundly. It wasn't until I slapped his face that his eyes flew open and he grabbed my hand to stop me from finishing the next swing of my wrist. He cuffed and shifted on the ground, attempting to pick himself back up. I was relieved to see that the blood leaking from the right side of his chest had already begun to slow. It seemed the wound was a lot more shallow than I had feared. Thankfully, the football pads had prevented the claws from reaching too deep. The cuts across his midsection were shallow, but the ripped wound across his shoulder looked bad. He was having trouble lifting his arm, leaving me to assume some tendons or ligaments may have been severed. As we sat side by side trying to collect ourselves, I let out a long sigh. "You look like shit," Josh said. Pointing at my face with his good arm, I rubbed my hand across my face and winced from pain of the swollen flesh beneath my fingertips. "You think she's dead?" he asked, nodding towards where Mary's lay still. "God, I hope so," I replied with a chuckle. Some minutes passed while we sat before convincing our weary bodies to raise up from the floor. We grunted and moaned with shared agony as we lifted ourselves to our feet. We slowly staggered in the direction of the mouth of the cave, when we heard another scream filled with primal rage from behind us. Before I knew it, I was knocked back to the ground. I spun in place to see Mary swat her hand at Josh, causing him to fly across the room and slam into the concrete wall. She turned back to face me and I watched her face distort into something barely human. Her mouth fell open and unhinged in a way that splayed it wide open like the mouth of a shark. Her brow folded into a scowl that formed a mass of wrinkles where it met her nose, and her eyes had turned into a shimmering black. Dark tears flowed from them, and they pulsed as though throbbing. Black hearts beat behind her sockets. She jumped on me and wrapped her fingers around my neck. Her fingernails pierced my flesh and I could feel blood leak out around them. She squeezed my throat and pounded my head against the ground. I felt my body growing weaker with every thrust, and my head was becoming light. My vision faltered and I could feel the life draining from within me. I was on the verge of allowing darkness to take me in, when I saw the rusted tip of a machete sliding towards me through Mary's throat. The contorted face before me softly formed back into the image of a cute, wide-eyed young girl, as her eyes morphed back into a human. Through dark eyes, she shifted her gaze to meet mine for the last time. Reality seemed to split before me and I found myself sitting at a table outside of an elegant little cafe on the side of a city street. I didn't recognize the city, nor did I understand why I was holding a strange reflective black rectangle in my hand. I noticed there were buttons on the side, so I pressed one with my forefingers. The thing I held was apparently some sort of device, which had a screen which showed me the time and date, August 4th, 2021. I looked around me to see the bustling streets filled with people coming and going, as extravagant-looking vehicles sped one by one. The voice of a pretty brunette waitress asked me if I'd like a refill, to which I absent-mindedly nodded. I watched her, filled up my teacup, and wandered back into the pleasant cafe. I caught my reflection on the window and found that I appeared dramatically older than I knew myself to be. I was balding, and what hair remained was gray. I had a thick beard and wore rimless glasses. I was mesmerized by my foreign reflection, but was brought back to my senses when I noticed two cars slam into each other behind me. I spun my head around in time to see a red sports car careening towards me. Everything went black for a second until I found myself back in that cave. My body was numb and a depression began to wake inside of me. I felt like I would never be happy again, as if the preview of my own death, though many years from now, awoke something hollow within. Maybe I had harbored a sort of disillusioned idea that I would live forever, and feeling my own inevitable end for one brief moment was enough for some sort of darkness to take hold of me. I raised my eyes to see the last glimmers of life leaving the cute wide-eyed girl in front of me. Her hand slid down my neck and she fell against me, resting her head on my shoulders. I shook my head momentarily, losing the memory of the vision Mary's gaze had shown me. The darkness had released its grip on me when I looked up to see Josh standing before me. Still wearing a very cracked helmet, holding a bloody machete in front of him, he was panting heavily and wearily asking, "Are you okay, man?" It would be way past midnight by the time we found ourselves back in the forest above. After leaving the cave and climbing up the stairs to the pleasant underground cottage, we took the time to look around the rest of the house to ensure there would be no more surprising visitors on our return trip home. Once we had inspected all the rooms, we cleaned our wounds in the second floor bathroom before going any further. Mary's bedroom was surprisingly typical of any teenage girl, and the cute stuffed unicorn laying beside her pillow sent a pang of guilt through my chest. All of her clothes were neatly folded or hanging in the closet. Her bedspread and clothes all shared the same dark colors, as did the curtains on the window we had previously seen light shine through. Even though we had no doubt she had indeed been responsible for awful events that had consumed Brady these past months, I still felt the weight of having taken part in ending her life. This experience would surely take a toll of my psyche in the years to come. We cleaned our wounds in the upstairs bathroom before starting our trek towards a rope that hung from the hole in the forest floor. We left the light on in Mary's room to light our path, as we had forgotten our torches and backpacks in the cave below. We briefly considered going back for them, but I had no desire to return to that place, and Josh showed no signs of disagreeing. Climbing the rope was no easy task as we were both fatigued, and Josh only had one fully functioning arm at the moment. I went up first and tried to pull my friend up as well as I could while he locked the rope between his leg and shuffled himself up while holding on one-handed. It took some time, but we found ourselves back between the darkened trees, though we had little idea which direction to go. We didn't spend long trying to find our footing, and after walking for what felt like hours, we were surprised by darting lights ahead. The search party had apparently been formed sometime before midnight, found us bloody and beaten sometime around 4 a.m. As it turned out that we had not remotely been walking in the right direction, and likely would have come across them some hours before, had we chosen the correct path. Clearly, directions were not our strongest attribute. My parents rushed to me and wrapped their arms around me as Jim Crawford, the resident sheriff of the city of Grady, led us out of the woods. Josh was greeted by his mother and older brother, Richard. They excitedly embraced him until he winced and grabbed his shoulder. His father was still apparently inside the forest, but had not allowed his wife and son to enter out of fear of what they could be facing given the tragedies of late. We were taken to the hospital in one of the neighboring towns and were patched up while officers questioned us on the night's events. We told them everything as we remembered it. Though they did not appear to believe a word, a thorough investigation of our claims was conducted over the following days, and upon finding the quaint cabin that lay beneath the forest above, they could not deny our story to be, at least mostly, factual. Some government officials came into town in the weeks ahead and roped off the woods to conduct their own investigation. We would never hear the results of what they may or may have not found, though, even if we hadn't moved away from Grady before the month came to a close. It was quite certain that they'd never share their findings with the public. Josh and I still stay in touch to this day. He became obsessed with researching supernatural phenomena, and even hooked up with a group of people who shared his shared interest, each with equally as mind-boggling personal experiences as ours. I've been to some of their meetings, and with their permission I have used their experiences in my writing. Malcolm, an especially nervous and paranoid but well-meaning associate of Josh, claims that what we saw in the woods that day was something named Lamia, and that Mary was possibly some sort of wraith who was perhaps raised by the scaled creature. These were only theories, of course, but it was something to give some semblance of closure. Josh and I took a road trip a couple of years back. We returned to Grady to find that the tragedies had indeed ended the day we walked out of those woods under the crescent moon. It made me proud of what we did that night. Looking at the happy and carefree children running through the park and laughing at the playground, though I still bear the burden of the lives we took that night. I still visit my therapist regularly, though she is not convinced that my memories are no more than a manifestation of some underlying mental suffering that my subconscious created. Though I still battle with memories of my childhood in Grady, life has been good, and I've made a happy life with good friends and a loving wife. I'm supposed to meet with a new publisher in the city tomorrow at a cafe named Blue Moon. It has a good reputation. It is known for serving quite the delicious cup of hot tea. I do believe I'm going to cancel that meeting though. I pay little attention to the date as my work is done from my office at home, and I don't always have a strict schedule I have to meet, but according to my cell phone, it's August 3rd today. Perhaps I can reschedule.